routine traffic stop becomes a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst fears collide with a truth he never expected. His target is the man who holds his future in his hands. The sun was setting over the streets of Phoenix, casting streaks of gold and crimson across the sky. Marcus Reed was driving home after a long day at the firm, his sedan gliding smoothly along the road. He adjusted the air conditioning, hoping to shake off the stress of the day. The faint hum of the radio filled the car, a welcome contrast to the noise of the city. As he approached an intersection, the yellow light flickered before turning red. He slowed to a stop, just as blue and red lights flared behind him, accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren. Marcus glanced into the rearview mirror, his brow tightening slightly before he pulled over. Rolling down his window, he watched as a police cruiser stopped behind him. Stepping out of the patrol car was Officer Grant Wallace, mid-30s, buzzed haircut, badge reflecting the last light of day. Adjusting his belt, Wallace approached Marcus's vehicle with the confidence of someone used to being in control. "License and registration," Wallace said, his voice clipped and authoritative. Marcus complied without hesitation, retrieving his documents from the glove compartment. His movements were measured, aware of Wallace's watchful gaze. As he handed over his license and registration, he could feel the officer's scrutiny intensify, as if searching for a deeper reason to escalate the stop. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Wallace asked, leaning slightly toward the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Marcus replied evenly, his tone respectful yet firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Wallace stated, though there was the faintest hesitation in his voice. Marcus frowned slightly, but gave a small nod. "I see. I thought I slowed in time, but I understand." Wallace didn't reply right away. Instead, he studied Marcus more closely, his posture shifting subtly. This wasn't just about a traffic violation anymore, at least, not in Wallace's mind. He glanced at the license in his hand. "You're not from around here, are you?" Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Wallace wasn't really listening. His tone had changed, his questions edged with something more than routine procedure. Marcus's steady demeanor seemed to throw Wallace off. The officer leaned in slightly. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Marcus answered, his voice calm. But the shift in the atmosphere between them was undeniable. Wallace wasn't just seeing Marcus as a driver anymore. He saw something else. Something that, in his mind, demanded suspicion. Marcus could feel the tension rise but remained composed. What Wallace didn't realize was that his calm wasn't ignorance, it was control, and this was just the beginning. Wallace took a step back. Folding Marcus's documents with deliberate slowness, Officer Wallace tucked them into his chest pocket. He straightened, a faint smirk settling on his face. He had already made up his mind about the man standing before him. "Step out of the car for me," Wallace ordered. Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened for just a moment, but his expression remained unreadable. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone even. Wallace's lips twitched, but he quickly masked it. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air. Marcus exhaled slowly before opening the door. As he stepped out, Wallace's gaze swept over him, taking in every detail. Marcus was slightly taller, his broad shoulders giving him an imposing presence, yet his demeanor remained composed. His tailored suit spoke of professionalism, his polished shoes hinted at precision and control, but none of that seemed to matter. Wallace gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus complied, his movements measured. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Wallace smirked. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Marcus turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Wallace. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or is this about something else?" The question landed like a blow, and for a split second, Wallace's composure faltered. His fingers twitched toward his belt. "More reflex than necessity." "Watch your tone," he said, voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question," Marcus replied. No defiance, just quiet certainty. Wallace leaned in. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. Got something to hide?" A beat of silence passed before Marcus answered. "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Wallace scoffed but said nothing. He stepped back, pacing a slow circle. Something about this wasn't unfolding the way he expected. Marcus wasn't nervous. No stammering, no fidgeting, just control. That poise put Wallace on edge. "You seem pretty confident," Wallace muttered almost to himself, "like you think you know how this is gonna go." Marcus didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Wallace stiffened. The smugness was gone, replaced by something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Marcus's composure was throwing him off balance. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then Wallace doubled down. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," he ordered. "I need to check for weapons." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" His tone held no panic, only quiet disbelief. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Wallace's jaw clenched. "I'm not going to ask again." Marcus held his gaze for a moment before turning, pressing his palms against the hood of his car. The crunch of Wallace's boots on asphalt filled the space between them. His search was quick but rough, his hands lingering longer than necessary. This wasn't just about safety, it was about control, an attempt to provoke. But Marcus didn't flinch. "You're clean," Wallace muttered. The words sounded begrudging, like a verdict he didn't want to give. Marcus turned back to face him, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am. Now, officer, if you're done, I'm not done." Wallace cut in, his voice rising slightly. It came out too fast, betraying his frustration. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Marcus folded his arms. His posture relaxed despite the crackling tension. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "That so? You a lawyer or something?" A faint smile crossed Marcus's lips. "Or something." The ambiguity only irritated Wallace further. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Marcus didn't move. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge. Wallace took the bait. "Fairness?" His voice dripped with something close to mockery. "You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always—" He stopped himself abruptly as if realizing he'd stepped too far. But the words lingered like smoke. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Subtle, unmistakable. "People like me?" he repeated, his voice calm, yet charged with meaning. Wallace tensed, stepping back slightly, as if he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You know what I mean," he muttered, but the conviction from earlier was gone. "I think I do," Marcus replied quietly. His calmness wasn't passive anymore. It was razor sharp. "And I think we both know," Marcus continued. "This stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Wallace opened his mouth to respond. The words didn't come. For the first time, Larson looked uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The balance of power had shifted, and now, for the first time, he stood on shaky ground. But the moment of reckoning was still ahead, and it would be one he'd never forget. Eric's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows knitted, his irritation flaring back to the surface. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though the faint crack in his tone suggested otherwise. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly. His eyes locked onto Larson's as he watched the officer's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." The words hung in the air, weighted with something unspoken. Larson's gaze followed Eric's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming badge. "Eric Porter," Eric said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larson froze. His eyes darted from the badge to Eric's face, searching for some sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only quiet, authority and a hint of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Larson repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Yes," Eric interrupted, saving him the trouble of finishing the thought. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." Larson's face paled, his once confident demeanor unraveled in real time. He took a small step back, his hand falling away from his belt, as though the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too heavy. Eric took a step forward, closing the gap Larson had instinctively created. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. Larson didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd walked into quicksand and had no idea how to escape. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, his voice steady. "Though that's bad enough, it's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to." Larson opened his mouth but no words came. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights," Eric went on. "That I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why?" Eric's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect." His words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of an indictment. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform." Larson's shoulders sagged slightly. the full weight of Eric's words landing squarely on him. He glanced down at the badge in Eric's hand again, as if it might somehow disappear if he didn't look too closely. Eric stepped back, giving Larson a moment to breathe, but his voice didn't lose its edge. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson's lips parted, but he hesitated, clearly, debating whether to push back or comply. The hesitation cost him, and then, Eric added, his voice lowering slightly, "You're going to hear from me again. Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Larson swallowed hard, his face reddening as the weight of the moment sank in. After a beat of silence, he reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Eric's license and registration. His hands trembled slightly as he handed them over. Eric took them without a word, tucking them into his wallet. He stepped toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing with one hand on the handle. Then, glancing over his shoulder, he met Larson's gaze one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," Eric said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As Eric slid back into his car and started the engine, Larson was left standing in the fading light, his confidence shaken, his future uncertain. But for Eric, this was far from over. His next move would ripple through the entire department. The drive home was quiet, but Eric's mind was anything but. The encounter played over in his head. Not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had dealt with like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, Eric had the authority to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, the early sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file lay open in front of him. Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Eric leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the broader implications. Larson wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeper problem, and Eric wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in, a stack of reports in hand. "Morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in Eric's tone. "Of course," she said before slipping out of the room. Eric turned his attention back to Larson's file, but his focus wasn't just on the officer. This was bigger than one man. Bigger than one interaction. It was about the culture that allowed someone like Larson to feel justified in his behavior. And if there was one thing Eric knew, it was that culture started at the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted, "but we've always handled it internally, quietly. And that's the problem," Eric replied. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels looked at him, the weight of the conversation etched into his face. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Eric made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Larson during the proceedings and watching as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Larson. It was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and local residents. He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, of the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. His words weren't just a call for accountability, they were a promise of change. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice resonating through the all. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building here, together. The applause was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As Eric stepped down from the podium, he glanced at the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. He knew change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right.